Jurado Municipal en honor a Gustavo Letner, y la presentadora del día de hoy es Luciana Piñeyro, quien es titular de la Unidad de Implementación de Justicia por Jurados del Consejo de la Magistratura de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires. Lu, cuando quieras iniciar.
Muchas gracias, Victoria, por tus palabras. Muy buenas tardes para todos y para todas. Muchas gracias por estar hoy acompañándonos en esta conferencia magistral en honor al doctor Gustavo Letner. Quiero comenzar agradeciendo especialmente a la directora ejecutiva del INESIP, Aldana Romano, por haberme invitado a presentar este panel de lujo. Sinceramente, bueno, me siento muy gratificada, pero a la vez sensibilizada por esta participación, por lo importante que fue el doctor Gustavo Letner, no solo en el ejercicio de mi actual función, sino también en el presente juradista de todos y todas las porteñas. Para los que a lo mejor no tuvieron la oportunidad de conocerlo a Gustavo, en el año 2013, cuando él se encontraba ejerciendo el cargo de consejero del Consejo de la Magistratura de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires, por el estamento judicial, ya que él también fue juez penal de la ciudad, me convocó para acompañarlo en esta misión de implementar el juicio por jurados en nuestro Poder Judicial local. Es así como emprendimos este largo camino de trabajo conjunto para que nuestra justicia cuente con un sistema de juzgamiento más transparente a través de la participación ciudadana. En este largo trayecto tuvimos una inmensa suerte de cruzarnos con muchísima gente maravillosa que nos fue inspirando y nos convenció cada vez más de que íbamos por el camino correcto. En este contexto me resulta imposible nombrar a cada uno porque fueron muchos los expertos y las expertas que nos acompañaron, pero siento que también sería injusta si no nombro a André Harfuch y a Edmundo Hendler, porque fueron los que con su inmensa generosidad nos guiaron en estos primeros pasos hacia esta aventura que, bueno, finalmente terminó con un final feliz. Digo final feliz porque recientemente, el 30 de septiembre, la legislatura porteña sancionó la ley de juicio por jurados para la ciudad de Buenos Aires. Así que yo no tengo duda de que Gustavo está muy contento, que su esfuerzo y su trabajo hoy se ven reflejados en la ley 6451. Así como también estoy reconvencida de que hoy para Gustavo es un día muy importante porque va a ser homenajeado por dos personas tan destacadas y tan prestigiosas. Así que agradecerles a John Gastil y a Nancy Marder por hoy ser parte de este panel y hacer posible el primero de los muchos homenajes que seguramente va a tener Gustavo. Antes de cederles la palabra a John y a Nancy, voy a hacer una breve exposición de su currículum vitae. John Gastil es profesor distinguido en el Departamento de Artes y Ciencias de la Comunicación y Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad Estatal de Pensilvania, donde también es investigador principal del Instituto McCartney para la Democracia. La investigación de John Gastil se centra en la teoría y la práctica de la democracia deliberativa. La National Science Foundation ha apoyado su investigación sobre los jurados estadounidenses y las reformas políticas en Australia y Estados Unidos. Ha publicado más de 100 libros, capítulos, artículos y ensayos. Nancy Marder es profesora visitante de Derecho en la Facultad de Derecho de Yale. Es profesora de Derecho en el Chicago Kent College of Law. Tiene una licenciatura en Inglés y estudios afroamericanos en el Yale College, un máster en Relaciones Internacionales por la Universidad de Cambridge, donde fue becaria Mellon, y un doctorado en Derecho por la Facultad de Derecho de Yale, donde fue editora de artículos del Yale Law Journal. Ha escrito artículos, organizado 6 simposios de revistas jurídicas y 2 conferencias sobre el jurado. Es autora del libro de Jury Process y ha escrito varios artículos sobre los jurados y jueces en la cultura popular. Es fundadora y directora del Justin John Paul Stevens Jury Center de Chicago Kent, que lleva a cabo proyectos especiales sobre el jurado. Bueno, les agradezco nuevamente a todos por estar hoy aquí y, como les decía Victoria, una vez que finalicen las exposiciones de los especialistas y especialistas, vamos a hacer preguntas o dudas que surjan durante las conferencias y yo se las voy a transmitir a cada uno de ellos. Muchísimas gracias. Le doy la palabra a John Gastil.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Greatly appreciated. I'm excited to be here today and speak to you about the jury system. Hold on, screen sharing just stopped. Oh, wonderful. All right, hang on. Technical difficulties. For some reason, it just stopped. Okay. And we're back. Screen sharing still working correctly, yes? Good, all right. We're gathered here to celebrate and investigate the jury system, which has begun to spread across Argentina at all levels. Before the jury arrived, it had existed in many countries for centuries. In those countries, the jury is seen as ordinary. I have a different point of view. I believe juries are special. I believe the jury system becomes a unique part of any democracy that embraces it. After conducting a decade of research on the American jury, I have had the pleasure of visiting Argentina 3 times to discuss how the jury system strengthens democracy. Whenever I describe this research project, audiences are surprised to learn that the impact of the jury was the same regardless of the jurisdiction or the nature of the case. We conducted a national study in several states in the United States, but when we collected detailed surveys of jurors before and after the trial, a large percentage of our juries had served in the municipal courthouse in Seattle, Washington. The municipal judges in Seattle were the only ones who permitted us to ask detailed questions of the jurors about their experience. My co-authors and I wrote an article focusing on those data, which revealed that jurors on municipal juries had a clear understanding of their responsibilities and took their job very seriously. Those jurors recognized the importance of their deliberation even on the lesser charges at the municipal court level. The crucial point is that when I talk about the democratic value of juries today, I am referring to all juries, including municipal juries. There are interesting variations between the impact of criminal and civil juries, but we found that criminal juries at every level of jurisdiction had an equally profound effect on many jurors. After all, serving on a jury is such a powerful and unique experience in one's life that it makes little difference whether it concerns municipal, state, or federal laws. So why are juries special? We label a country democratic when it begins to hold free and fair elections. People live in a democratic political system if their nation's laws protect their political freedoms, such as freedom of association and freedom of speech, freedom of the press. The jury is different from each of these. The jury does not elect officers. Jurors are chosen at random. Jurors arrive at the courthouse as strangers and leave after serving only briefly. A jury does not secure political liberties. If a person is called for jury duty, that person has not a freedom but an obligation. In this sense, jury service is more a responsibility than a right. The role of the juror during a trial is to serve. People live in a democratic political system, whether or not they have a jury necessarily, but the jury can play a powerful role in shaping how people think about democracy. It can help them to learn to listen. When juries start talking during deliberation, they do so in private, though, where not even the judge can hear them. In the 21st century, many people remain skeptical about the wisdom of juries. But in countries with established jury systems, the vast majority of citizens value the jury as a symbol of deliberation and citizen empowerment. To live in a society with juries is to live in a country that asks the people to take responsibility for their own government. Each time a jury deliberates, it creates a living example of what a democracy looks like on a scale so small that people can see and touch it. As the leader of the Jury and Democracy Project here at Penn State, I have spent more than a decade studying juries to understand what they mean to citizens, particularly to those individuals who get the opportunity to serve on a jury. Our research includes statistical analyses of thousands of jurors, which I will discuss later, but we also have gathered personal stories from jurors who were inspired by their experience. Consider the words of one juror in our study who found the experience as powerful the second time as he did the first. Quote, "This is the second time in my life I've been called for jury duty, and I think now, as I did then, that our system is about the best anyone could have. Most jurors take their responsibilities seriously and do the best to be fair and listen to all the evidence before making any judgments. How fortunate we are to live in America." Or I would add, Argentina. The people of Argentina now share the good fortune of living in a country that uses juries for criminal trials. Across Argentina, juries have been summoned, they have deliberated, and they have returned verdicts. At first, each jury trial was a news event in Argentina, but the jury system is quickly becoming more ordinary than extraordinary, and this is good. The jury should become a regular part of life in Argentina. As the jury system becomes more common, however, my job today is to remind us of what makes it special. I begin with a basic question. What are the essential features of the jury system in a democracy? To count as a jury, a body of citizens must first consist of a representative cross-section of a community. It must sit through a fair trial. It must have the autonomy to decide a verdict, but it must first go through a period of thoughtful deliberation. Permit me to review briefly each of these four requirements. First, a jury must have what political scientists call descriptive representation. A jury's members must be chosen from the wider community without prejudice for ethnicity, class, gender, or other social characteristics. Discrimination in jury selection can occur through the way a list of names is created for summoning juries. It can occur when a potential juror's employer threatens punishment if the citizen answers the summons to serve. It can occur during voir dire when judges or attorneys exhibit bias in who they exclude. Every citizen must have the same basic right to serve in the jury system. Individuals should only be removed from a jury when there is a clear and specific bias in that juror that prevents them from being fair in that particular case. Some of the most notorious jury verdicts in the history of England and the United States resulted from homogeneous juries. Juries composed entirely of white men often reached verdicts biased against women and minorities. Argentina begins its jury system already with an awareness of the importance of including women, indigenous people, and other social groups in its jury pool, but this right to serve must be protected. Second, the wisdom of a jury's judgment depends on the quality of the trial the jury sees. It's essential that both parties in the trial have strong legal representation, that the jury learns the most relevant facts of the case, and that the judge acts to ensure a fair trial. We cannot expect juries to perform their duties well if they do not get access to all the relevant evidence, or if that evidence is presented in too confusing, misleading, or biased a manner. A defective trial system can make it impossible for a jury to do its job. Third, juries must have the legal autonomy to deliver their verdicts. The privacy of jury deliberation is meant to ensure that juries can reach their judgments without influence of judges or others who might interfere with their work. Like the secret ballot that voters use in the voting booth, the jury's private deliberations are essential to ensure the autonomy of a jury. And once a jury has spoken, the case should be concluded, except in special cases where a defendant might have grounds to appeal a guilty verdict. Finally, juries need to engage in high quality and democratic deliberation. Juries must weigh evidence carefully, and they should be discouraged from taking an early vote before reviewing the facts of the case. Jury research have found that juries begin by reviewing the evidence. Those that do so are more thoughtful, and good jury procedures do not rush the jury to reach a quick verdict. Likewise, the deliberative process must be democratic in that every juror's voice gets a chance to be heard. The requirement of unanimity for criminal trials in the United States helps to achieve this purpose. Research on group behavior shows that small groups using a majority decision rule often ignore minority views, whereas a unanimity requirement can encourage more thoughtful decisions by the jury. This brings us to the main question of my talk. What is the effect of a jury system on a democracy? Establishing a jury system has a direct benefit for democracy. The jury gives to citizens a voice in the legal system. The jury's democratic authority is consistent with the idea of self-government, which is the most fundamental feature of democracy. The other major benefits of the jury system are the effect it has on jurors, institutions, and the wider society. The research project that I oversee has studied these effects by conducting juror surveys and examining legal archives. We also have investigated the jury's complex effects on society by looking at a wider array of evidence. In the remainder of this talk, I will discuss how the jury system can improve the health of a democracy. The figure you see on the screen summarizes the jury's effects, and I will review each of these. I begin by discussing how deliberating on a jury can transform a private individual into a more passionate and powerful democratic citizen. Consider the experience of a juror who served near the city of Seattle, Washington, in the northwestern United States. This juror, who I call Maria, was a middle-aged homemaker who said she was fascinated by the process she saw. The modern courthouse she attended impressed her, but she was even more pleased by what happened inside the courthouse. While serving as a juror on a 2-month trial, Maria kept reminding herself that the defendant was on trial for murder. Maria said she was careful to pay attention, remembering everything and keep a clear and open mind. She recognized that her decision would affect this person for the rest of their life. Maria told our interviewer that her 12-person jury was an amazing group, but once her jury began to work inside a cramped room at the courthouse, their deliberations became stressful. Driving home after the first day of deliberation, Maria confessed that she had burst into tears and cried all the way home. The next morning, Maria argued with the foreperson about the murder charges, and then another juror stepped in and explained how the jury was supposed to deliberate. The juror reminded Maria that we all have to come to consensus together. They gradually worked through their disagreements and returned a guilty verdict, murder in the first degree. Looking back on her experience, Maria believed that it had changed her. After it was all over, she said, I realized how much I liked the law, how much it meant to me to put all of the pieces of the puzzle together, and how important it was to get my verdict in. Her 2 weeks in the courthouse made her want to make a bigger difference in her community, and she said that she's now volunteering more often and becoming more politically involved. The jury experience even made her decide to go back to work outside the house. She said serving on a jury made her want to do something with passion and purpose. Maria was certain that her jury experience made her more active in politics and civil society, but how often does it have that effect? To answer that question, we obtained a grant from the National Science Foundation to collect public records for thousands of jurors in 8 different counties across the United States, as shown in this slide. This research method gave us a large sample of jurors, and for each of those individuals, we collected another piece of data. We used county election records to find out how often these individuals voted before and after serving on a jury. To understand this particular study, consider 2 important facts. First, voting in the United States is voluntary. Most of my country's citizens choose not to vote in most of our elections. Our study was a test of whether the experience of serving on a jury could make such a person more likely to vote. Second, in the United States, even after being selected for a criminal jury, there are many reasons that a person may never get to participate in jury deliberation. A person can be named as an alternate, or the trial may end without deliberation for legal reasons, such as when a criminal charge is withdrawn during a trial. These variations create what social scientists call a natural experiment, one in which people chosen to serve on a jury are split into 2 groups, those who get to deliberate and those who are seated on a jury but never deliberated. When we compared these 2 groups, we found that serving on a jury trial increased a person's odds of voting in elections during the years that followed. This participation effect on jury service, added up to roughly a 4 to 7% increase in voter turnout for several years. The slide you see in front of you shows that the voting effect of even just a few days of jury service, such as on a municipal jury, which can be very brief, was as powerful as an entire semester spent in a civics course, or a whole year serving in student government in school. In other words, jury service is, to quote Tocqueville, one of the most efficacious means for the education of the people which society can employ. Our study also showed that the participation effect can come from any deliberating jury, regardless of whether it reaches a verdict or becomes a hung jury. Only 1 in 20 juries become hung juries, but their experience of democratic deliberation is as powerful as it is for other juries. In addition, we found that the participation effect in trials weighing both minor and more serious crimes was the same. The effect was stronger when juries had to return several verdicts for multiple charges. Juries weighing more charges do face a more complex task because they make more decisions, often involving interlocking judgments and mixed verdicts. In addition to this national study, we conducted detailed surveys of jurors in and near Seattle, Washington, in the same jurisdiction where we heard about Maria's experience. We surveyed thousands of individuals before, after, and several months after they served on juries. Our results showed that many jurors changed their civic attitudes and political behaviors as a result of participating in the jury system. For instance, jury service could make jurors more confident in their ability to participate effectively in politics and in civil society. Jury service also made jurors more interested in watching news on television and talking about local issues with fellow citizens. Our surveys also showed that there were key features of jury trials that explained the jury's civic impact. These are important to consider when thinking about how to design the jury in Argentina. Here are 4 examples. First, jurors experienced the most powerful changes in their civic attitudes and behaviors when they felt that the judges and attorneys had treated them with tremendous respect. Second, those jurors who found jury trials more interesting and emotionally engaging experienced more profound changes. Third, when jurors were satisfied with their deliberation and verdict, they were more likely to become engaged citizens. Finally, jurors responded more strongly to their service experience when their judge took a minute at the end of the trial to thank them for their service, particularly when the jury had witnessed a difficult case or had been unable to reach a verdict. When the judge interacts regularly with jurors, the experience can also influence the judges. Think for a moment about the experience a typical criminal judge has when presiding over a courtroom. In trial after trial, the judge hears about the worst crimes committed in society. Contrast against the jury itself, a cross-section of the community that demonstrates good judgment and civic responsibility nearly every week. Reflecting on my own personal experience as a juror, my fellow jurors and I deliberated for 2 days on a minor criminal case. In the end, we found the defendant not guilty of check forgery because the accused had not successfully completed the check he intended to forge. Afterward, the judge complimented us on having understood the law and the evidence correctly, and it was clear he had seen many juries before us deliberate just as carefully. Past studies in the United States and a more recent one in South Korea have shown that juries and judges generally reach similar verdicts, though juries may be more lenient in certain cases. Professional judges can become skeptical of the public's wisdom, but putting juries in front of judges every week can help sustain a judge's faith in the democratic legal system. The verdicts juries reach also have an influence on the larger democratic process. Though a single verdict resolves only a single legal case, the echo of a jury's judgment can be heard for years. In both criminal and civil cases, the verdicts that juries reach can influence the future behavior of attorneys, judges, and police officers. When defense attorneys and prosecutors negotiate before trial, the agreements they reach incorporate their beliefs about what would happen if that case was tried in front of a jury. In the United States, for example, when juries became more confident in the power of DNA evidence, prosecutors gained more leverage in plea bargaining when they had strong DNA evidence pointing to the accused. On the other hand, if jurors have found that police in their community have mishandled evidence and as a result acquitted defendants, this can affect not only prosecutions, but also the local police department, which has to become more careful about how it collects, stores, and analyzes evidence from crime scenes. Also, consistent patterns of jury verdicts can inspire legislation. In the United States, some proposed laws intend to limit the freedom that juries have to impose large financial penalties in civil cases. More progressive laws have been established to ensure more diverse juries when all white juries have returned a pattern of verdicts that appear to discriminate against minority defendants. More interesting is the subtle effect that juries can have on the design of the political system itself. Juries have become a model for deliberation in the United States, both because they directly involve the mass public through random selection. Modern civic reformers have argued that political systems need to apply the lessons of the jury to the other problems we face as a society. The large-scale impacts of jury deliberation and verdicts can be powerful, but even a single verdict can influence the individual jurors who read it to their judge. As one juror said during an interview, when we sit on a jury, we hold a defendant's freedom in our hands. Our research found that sometimes the civic impact of jury service could be shaped by the verdicts that the jurors reached. In particular, when juries reach guilty verdicts, it can inspire some jurors to try to make a difference in the communities where the crime occurred. For some jurors, they may believe that getting more involved as volunteers could help prevent the next crime from occurring. Jury verdicts also influence the wider society. A guilty verdict from a single judge can enrage a community that suspects the judge of bias, indifference, or corruption. When a jury of peers from that same community reaches the same verdict, protests may still occur, as they have recently in the United States for high-profile juries. Even so, many citizens see the jury as less of a judge and more as a mirror, which reflects back to the community its judgment of the accused. When a jury leaves the courthouse, it signifies the end of their service, but it also usually means the end of a criminal case. This is among the most important functions of the jury, to bring closure to a conflict by asking the community to decide the fate of one of its own members. In its own way, small juries can maintain peace in the community more effectively than even hundreds of police officers. Juries can influence civil and political society in more ways. As I said before, jury deliberation can change forever the individual citizens who participate in it. Fortunately, the jurors who get this chance to deliberate often share their experiences with others. Nearly all the jurors in our study, for instance, said they talked about their service in the courthouse with family, friends, and coworkers. Not every juror has a satisfying experience, but the vast majority do. Within their social networks, former jurors often become unofficial ambassadors for the legal system, for the idea of deliberation, and for democracy itself. Jurors remind the rest of us what it means to take responsibility for governing ourselves, both in our courthouses and in our wider communities. As I conclude my remarks today, I wish to make two final points about the jury system. First, remember that much of what I have said comes from large-scale research projects carried out by my research team and other scholars, including some in the audience today. Theorizing about the nature of juries and democracy is useful, but there can be no substitute for direct observation. For this reason, I am pleased that scholars here in Argentina are studying jury trials carefully in this country and the effect jury service has on those who serve. For those in the legal profession, I ask you to keep the courthouse doors open to researchers who need access to judges and juries to conduct these important studies. Second, I stress again the importance of the jury as a part of the democratic process. The jury is not a machine that produces verdicts. The jury has intrinsic value as a form of self-government. The jury reminds us of the importance of our civic responsibilities. It asks us to listen carefully to facts before reaching a judgment. It provides a model of citizen deliberation that can inspire innovative democratic institutions. Most of all, the jury can transform relatively passive private individuals into empowered democratic citizens. Thank you so much for your time.
Muchas gracias, John, por tu exposición. Realmente muy interesante todos los conceptos que nos has transmitido y también toda tu experiencia en materia de investigación. Le vamos ahora a conceder la palabra a Nancy Marder y bueno, estamos atentos a las preguntas que vayan surgiendo, si las quieren ir canalizando por el chat y al finalizar la exposición las vamos a transmitir. Gracias.
Great. I hope you can hear me. And okay, great. And my slides are back. Great. Good afternoon. I want to thank INICEP and its executive director, Aldana Romano, for inviting me to give this talk. And I'd also like to thank the Embassy of the United States in Argentina for sponsoring this Congress. It's an amazing Congress spanning 8 days and addressing an amazing array of topics. I also want to acknowledge that this talk is given in honor of Gustavo Letner, who played a key role in helping to establish the trial by jury in provinces in Argentina. In addition to being a judge, a lecturer, and a university professor, Gustavo Letner did so much for advancing the jury in Argentina, including organizing a jury office, editing 3 books on the jury, co-organizing the Second International Congress on Trial by Juries, which included my colleagues and co-editors, Valerie Hans and Shari Diamond. And I also had the honor of meeting him at a conference in Mexico City. He passed away at the beginning of this year, but his contributions to the jury in Argentina endure. My goal today is to describe the work that I have done on how citizens are transformed into jurors in the United States, with a focus on how that works with jury deliberations. And then I'll consider how my work could apply to jury deliberations in municipal juries in Argentina. I will begin by briefly describing the book that I'm writing, called The Power of the Jury, Transforming Citizens into Jurors, so that you will have a sense of how jury deliberations fit into the jury process. The book seeks to address a broad question: what makes juries work? It does not seem possible that a group of 12 randomly chosen individuals who have no legal training, no expertise in the subject of the trial, no experience adjudicating legal claims, and no real guidance about how to work together as a group can fairly and correctly decide the fate of the parties on matters about which groups know little or nothing. Think of the famous American jury film, 12 Angry Men, which you should all see if you haven't seen it already. The film shows how a motley group of jurors, many of whom are unhappy about serving as jurors and who are eager to leave, become a jury. You can stay there on the slides. Many of whom are unhappy about serving as jurors and who are eager to leave become a jury that works successfully as a group to reach a unanimous verdict based on the evidence that they carefully examine. In spite of the challenges, the American jury system works reasonably well. What accounts for its success? The answer, I argue, lies in the jury process and the ways in which every stage of the jury process helps to transform citizens into jurors, even though the citizens and other trial participants might be unaware of this process. The various stages of the jury process include the summons, voir dire, instructions, and deliberations, and each stage helps citizens to step into their role as jurors. The final stage of the jury process, which is the juror's post-verdict interview with the judge, helps jurors to leave their role as jurors behind and to resume their lives as private citizens. It also helps them to serve as emissaries for the jury system. Former jurors become emissaries because they end up thinking highly of the jury and of their jury experience, as John mentioned in his talk, and are willing to share their experience with family and friends. Even if citizens do not want to be jurors initially, or do not think that they can perform their task well, every stage of the jury process helps to transform them from citizens who do not want to serve into jurors who perform their role responsibly. Although the jury process carries out this transformation of citizens into jurors reasonably well, there's still room for improvement. Each of the stages of the jury process can be improved upon by looking at the process as a whole rather than in isolation, and by ensuring that any reforms further the transformation of citizens into jurors. So my focus today will be on jury deliberations. In federal and state courts in the United States, after the judge has read the final instructions aloud, the jurors leave the courtroom and enter the jury room, where they will conduct their deliberation. The traditional view of jury deliberations is that jurors enter the jury room and know what to do. Other than the requirement that they have a foreperson, the judge usually provides no guidance about the deliberations. The traditional view of jury deliberations is that jurors can perform their tasks of deliberating and reaching a unanimous verdict without any guidance from the judge on how to proceed when they enter the jury room. Underlying this approach is the idea that the deliberations are the province of the jurors and the judge must respect the jury's independence at this stage. Although the traditional view of jury deliberations as the sole province of the jury ensures jury independence, it has some limitations because there are times when the jurors would like guidance, even if they choose not to follow it in the end. Even though the start of deliberations is a time when jurors might feel uncertain about how to proceed, the judge, in accordance with the traditional view, does not offer jurors any guidance. From the jurors' perspective, then, the traditional view of deliberations leaves them uncertain how to begin their deliberations. Similarly, judges are reticent to respond to any questions the jury has once it has begun its deliberations. The jury is permitted to send a note to the judge whenever it has a question, even though the judge does not typically instruct the jury that it can do this. Some judges resist answering the jury's questions. Others respond by calling everyone back into the courtroom and just rereading the relevant portion of the instruction or testimony. If the jury reaches an impasse and sends a note to the judge, the traditional response is to deliver what's called, at least in federal court, an Allen charge, which tells the jurors to go back to the jury room and to deliberate some more. Jury deliberations have certain structural features that help transform citizens into jurors who are then able to work together as a jury. One structural feature that helps jurors to see themselves as part of a group is the jury's isolation in the jury room. That's the first item on my slide, and we'll be following this slide. The jurors are kept together in the jury room throughout their deliberations and are kept apart from everyone else. This isolation reinforces the jurors' group identity. It helps them to maintain their focus. They are to do nothing else but deliberate. And it signals to them that they will have to depend on each other as they deliberate. Everything that they say during their deliberations is protected by the secrecy of the jury room. While jurors are deliberating, they're not allowed to discuss what is said in the jury room with anyone outside the jury room, including family and friends. What is said in the jury room stays in the jury room, at least until the jury is dismissed, and even longer in some states in the United States. In addition, the jurors constitute an unusual kind of group in that they're supposed to speak to each other candidly. They don't have to worry about how their views will be received outside the jury room because their views are to remain inside the jury room, at least while they're deliberating. The secrecy of the jury room not only protects what jurors say to each other, but also protects them from outside influence. There are also several structures that ensure that the jury engages in a careful and thorough deliberation. One such feature is that the jury must have a foreperson. The foreperson has to start the deliberations and to figure out how best to proceed. All juries in the United States, state and federal, require juries to have a foreperson. The foreperson who uses his or her role to ensure that other jurors participate in the deliberations and listen respectfully to each other will help the other jurors to become engaged in the task of the group. The foreperson has to put the needs of the jury above his or her own needs. All of the jurors will have to learn to do this, but the foreperson has to do it from the beginning of the deliberation. And if the foreperson does this well, then he or she can serve as a model for the other jurors. Another structural feature is that the jurors have instructions to follow. In the United States, the judge reads the instructions aloud in open court as everyone listens to the reading. In some courts, the jurors are given individual written copies of the instructions, which they can take notes on during the reading and which they can take with them into the jury room and consult during their deliberations. The jurors might not understand all of the instructions, but they know that their deliberations are to be grounded in the instructions. The instructions also ensure that the jurors start their deliberations as equals in that they've all heard the instructions read aloud by the judge in open court. The instructions reinforce the jurors' equality in the jury room. Each juror has only to turn to the instructions to buttress his or her argument. The instructions allow citizens who are lay people, unfamiliar with the law, to work together as jurors to reach an understanding of the instructions as a group. If the jurors have questions about the instructions, they can send a note to the judge who should try to answer their questions or to explain why he or she is not permitted to do so. Several of the instructions, such as the one that prohibits jurors from discussing the trial on social media or from doing research online about the trial, also help jurors to constrain each other's behavior for the sake of the group. Such instructions require the jurors to police themselves throughout their deliberations, and in doing so, help to transform them from citizens into jurors by giving them responsibility to look after each other and to take action on behalf of the group if an individual juror violates how the group is supposed to behave. One example of jurors self-policing during deliberations can be seen in the film 12 Angry Men. When one juror expresses bias against Puerto Ricans, the other jurors point out his bias and make clear that it interferes with sound judgment. And we'll go to the next slide and see if we're able to play this 3-minute video clip from 12 Angry Men.
I don't understand you people. I mean, all these picky little points you keep bringing up, they don't mean nothing. You saw this kid just like I did. You're not going to tell me you believe that phony story about losing the knife and that business about being at the movies? Look, you know how these people lie? It's born in them. I mean, what the heck? I don't have to tell you. They don't know what the truth is. And let me tell you, they don't need any real big reason to kill someone either. No, sir. They get drunk. Oh, they're real big drinkers, all of them. You know that. And bang, someone's lying in the gutter. Well, nobody's blaming them for it. That's the way they are, by nature. You know what I mean? Violent. Where are you going? Human life don't mean as much to them as it does to us. Look, they're lushing it up and fighting all the time. And if somebody gets killed, so somebody gets killed. They don't care. Oh, sure, there's some good things about them, too. Look, I'm the first one to say that. I've known a couple who were okay, but that's the exception, you know what I mean? Most of them, it's like they have no feelings. They can do anything. What's going on here? I'm trying to tell you, you're making a big mistake, you people. This kid is a liar. I know it. I know all about them. Listen to me. They're no good. There's not a one of them who's any good. I mean, what's happening in here? I'm speaking my piece, and you... Listen to me. We're this kid on trial here. His type. Well, don't you know about them? There's a danger here. These people are dangerous. They're wild. Listen to me. Listen.
I have. Now sit down and don't open your mouth again.
So I'm trying to tell you.
It's always difficult to keep personal prejudice out of a thing like this. Wherever you run into it, prejudice always obscures the truth. I don't really know what the truth is. I don't suppose anybody will ever really know. 9 of us now seem to feel that the defendant is innocent. But we're just gambling on probabilities. We may be wrong. We may be trying to let a guilty man go free. I don't know. Nobody really can. But we have a reasonable doubt. And that's something that's very valuable in our system. No jury can declare a man guilty unless it's sure.
And we'll go on to the next slide. Which is, you'll see the list that we're going to continue with, which is, and now I'll start with another structural feature, which is that the jurors need to engage in a particular type of deliberation in which they give reasons for their views. It's not enough to simply announce their views, they need to explain them, particularly if they want to persuade other jurors to see the evidence the way they do. Jurors' reasons either persuade their fellow jurors or they do not. And if they do not, they must look for other reasons or be willing to change their own view of the case. Thus, this group endeavor can lead jurors to hold different views in the end than they held at the beginning. The group deliberation can change their views. They might think of arguments that they never would have thought of if they were deciding the case on their own. Or they might still see the case the way that they did at the beginning, but through the group deliberation, they learn that there are other ways to view the case. The process of deliberating, and in particular of having to give reasons for one's own view and listening to reasons for others' views, can indeed lead to a transformation in how one sees the case and how one understands one's own role as a juror. No juror can be ignored because a unanimous verdict requires every juror's vote. It is significant that the jurors must vote and not just say that they agree. They must either raise their hand or write down their verdict on a piece of paper, depending on the type of vote that the jury agrees to take. The unanimity requirement imposes a formidable structure on the deliberations. The jurors need to listen to each other, particularly to those jurors who do not agree with the majority. If the majority ignores any of the dissenting jurors, then it's unlikely that the jury will reach a unanimous verdict. If the jurors reach a unanimous verdict and return to the courtroom where the verdict will be announced, the judge can poll them individually to ensure that the verdict represents their vote. Even though the jury verdict is a group decision and the jurors do not have to give reasons for the verdict except to each other during their deliberations, they might have to announce in open court that the verdict represents their vote. The polling of jurors who are seated in the box takes place in open court before the judge, the parties, the public, and the press. It requires each juror to take responsibility for his or her vote and for the jury's verdict in this public setting. If the jury cannot reach unanimity, the judge could have the lawyers present additional arguments to help the jury overcome its impasse, rather than simply telling the jurors to keep deliberating. In this way, the judge can help the jury have a better process for its deliberations without interfering with the verdict the jury ultimately reaches. If, in spite of the additional argument to help the jury overcome its impasse, the jury is still unable to reach unanimity, it becomes a hung jury and is dismissed. These structural features, which encourage certain behaviors from the jurors, help them to understand that they are being called upon to make a decision that is quite out of the ordinary. It is a decision that can have momentous consequences for the parties and the community. Although jurors have to conduct their own deliberations, there are steps that judges can take that will aid jurors at the moments when they need assistance and will enable jury deliberations to be more effective at transforming
Si les parece, con el permiso de las traductoras, hay algunas preguntas, si quieren hasta que conectemos nuevamente con Nancy, podemos ir haciéndolas a John, si están de acuerdo. John, ¿estás por ahí como para formularte alguna pregunta que surgió del público?
Por supuesto, of course, I'm here.
Gracias, John. Consulta. En Argentina estamos próximos a implementar los jurados a nivel municipal. ¿Qué recomendaciones puedes realizar a partir de la experiencia tuya?
Well, a few recommendations. Perhaps more specific questions can tell me what are some of the questions that remain for how to design the jury. One detail from our research I did not mention is that Valerie Hans, a world-renowned jury scholar who has visited Argentina many times over the last several years, she led a study reanalyzing our data, looking specifically at civil juries. We had initially found a more limited benefit or civic impact from service on a civil jury, but what her more careful statistical analysis showed is that the problem was that some civil juries are more different from criminal juries than they need to be. In particular, full-size civil juries, that is, civil juries with 12 jurors, were more likely to have a strong impact on the jurors. Likewise, the larger a majority, preferably a unanimity that was required, the larger the impact. In other words, Sometimes for municipal juries, jurisdictions choose very small juries that maybe have something closer to majority rule. And I just encourage giving people more opportunity to serve on juries with larger ones and try to stick to the unanimity principle. So those are some features that you can consider just to make the jury experience more available to more people.
I'm back.
Welcome back, Nancy. We jumped ahead to Q&A, but perhaps now's a good time. Luciana, why don't you take back the organization here?
So I wonder if I could,
Okay,
I'm up to,
muchas gracias, John, por este ratito tuyo, y le volvemos a dar la palabra a Nancy, y al finalizar, Nancy, retomamos nuevamente las preguntas. Gracias.
yeah. Okay, I will just, I'm on my last section where I'm applying all of this to Argentina's municipal juries. So if we could move ahead to the next slide, in which I ask, how could the transformation view of deliberations help shape jury deliberations in the new municipal juries in Argentina? And I note that there are 4 municipalities or cities pursuing municipal juries so far. A municipality of Neuquén and the city of Rosario already have new systems for municipal juries, and a municipality of Corrientes and the city of Mendoza are interested in having municipal juries. So what might they consider doing to help ensure that the citizens who serve on these municipal juries are transformed into jurors? And if we could go to the next slide and consider what the city of San Patricio del Chanar in Neuquén has done. So going forward, yeah, perfect. So the ordinance providing for municipal court of juries in San Patricio del Chanar in Neuquén indicates that this city intends to put into effect many of the structures that will help to transform citizens into jurors. So in terms of the isolated jury room, the municipal court of juries will, quote, deliberate in private session. In terms of the secrecy of the jury room, the jury will deliberate in a secret and continuous session. In terms of the foreperson, the jurors, quote, will elect the president of the tribunal. And in terms of instructions from the ordinance, quote, the coordinator of the tribunal, who's a lawyer, will begin by presenting the parties to the jury and will explain succinctly the rules of the trial that they must know at the time. In terms of the unanimity, quote, the municipal court of juries will deliberate until reaching a unanimous judgment. And in terms of impasse, quote, the coordinator and the parties will carry out the necessary measures to help the jury overcome the stalemate, end quote. And in terms of a hung jury, quote, if the jury does not reach unanimity within a reasonable time, the trial will be declared stalled and a new jury hearing may be held before another jury. So what the ordinance does not explicitly provide for, at least not yet, are the following: that the jurors need to deliberate by giving reasons for their views, that the jurors need to take a vote, expressing agreement is not sufficient, and that the jurors should be polled when they return to the courtroom to announce their verdict and to ensure that they agree with the verdict. So this is based on the ordinance, but we'll have to wait and see how these features are actually put into effect. So I just want to leave you with 2 concluding thoughts. 2 implications of the transformation view are that more citizens can serve as jurors once they realize that they don't have to know how to be a juror from the beginning. More citizens can serve because the stages of the jury process, including the deliberation, will help them to recognize and put aside their biases and other behaviors that interfere with the group effort. Instead, they'll be transformed from citizens into jurors by going through the several stages of the jury process, including the structures that are built into the deliberations. And 2, before considering any reforms to municipal juries in the future, reformers should ask whether the reforms will help to transform citizens into jurors. Just as several provinces in Argentina implemented jury trials and found that they worked, it seems fitting that municipalities and cities should extend the practice and see how municipal juries work. And I look forward to seeing how the new municipal juries work and what we learn from their innovative practices. So my last slide has sources for further reading. And with that, we can go back to the questions and answers. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Nancy, por tu exposición. Realmente muy importante escucharte con tu experiencia. Quiero ahora continuar nuevamente con las preguntas que fueron realizando las personas que están presenciando el panel. Esta es una pregunta abierta, así que la puede contestar cualquiera de los dos. Atendiendo que son paneles más cortos los de los jurados municipales, ¿vieron alguna diferencia en las deliberaciones entre los 5 y 7 jurados y la de las deliberaciones de 12 jurados?
I'll start with this and then toss to you, Nancy. Yeah, as I was saying during the earlier question, the larger juries do have a more complex task. There are more points of view to be taken into account. If we think of a jury as a jury of one's peers, that is a jury made up of members of the wider communities to which a defendant might belong, it's hard to represent the diversity of that community with just 5 people. When you get to 12 people, it has a better chance at representation, and that represents diversity and complexity. So the different points of view that people bring to the evidence, I think, can make for a more engaging and challenging deliberation, which is possibly why, as I said, at least in the case of civil juries, the larger juries have a more lasting impact on the jurors themselves. Nancy?
And in terms of group dynamics, the larger jury is, you have greater input from a variety of perspectives of jurors. So in the United States, there had been this big fight about the size of the jury, and for reasons of efficiency and cost cutting, a number of states had moved to smaller juries. But the challenge is that then it undercuts, as John was saying, the diversity of the jury, because that's important. And with the smaller jury, you run the danger of getting an outlier verdict, one that's, sort of less representative of the group. So the larger jury is more closer to the ideal, and you run more risks with the smaller jury. But those are the limitations.
Muchas gracias. Justo había otra pregunta que se vincula con lo que Nancy recién nos explicaba, que preguntan si hay estrategias de convocatorias puntuales para garantizar la representatividad en el jurado en Seattle.
Or in anywhere, Nancy. I wouldn't say the question is not limited to Seattle. Yeah.
So it's very important the ways in which you summon jurors, and that it should be from a diverse or multiple lists, so that you could again reach as broad a swath of the community as possible. And in the United States, this remains a perennial challenge. And we talk about calling people from multiple lists as a way of reaching a representative group, and of having updated lists so that summons aren't returned as undeliverable. And now there's some experimentation going on when summons are returned as undeliverable because perhaps the person's moved, sending out a summons to that same zip code as a way, again, making sure that you have drawn from a fair cross-section. So the lists and how you reach people is important. And then once they enter the courtroom, how you remove people is also important. So yes, this is a very important part of making sure that you have a fair cross-section.
I will continue right where Nancy was ending. So once the jurors have been summoned, in the United States, typically they arrive in an assembly room and are then randomly selected for a specific courtroom. It's at that courtroom where the voir dire process occurs. That's the process where the particular jury is formed from that larger set of potential jurors. And that is a place where many problems can occur, biases that systematically exclude one kind of juror or another. In parts of the United States, for example, African Americans have sometimes been discriminated against in placement on a jury. So in other words, someone might answer the summons, be selected for a courtroom, perhaps even be identified as a potential juror, but then removed during voir dire because of bias. What I want to stress is that in the United States, Powers versus Ohio, a particular Supreme Court case, established that when it comes to discrimination in the jury pool, you're violating the rights of the juror. Now, it's not even about the defendant in some cases. It's about the right that I have as a citizen to get equal consideration to serve on juries. And I think that's such an important principle in Argentina, because again, the diversity of the jury is crucial for the trial, for the defendant, but it's also a civic educational opportunity, a unique one for every citizen. And if we discriminate in the voir dire, if we discriminate in the jury selection, we're not only harming the trial and the court, but we're also harming the juror who was denied the chance to serve.
Just to follow up on that, one more point is we're hurting the community as well, because we want the verdict to be accepted as legitimate.
Muchas gracias a ambos. Otra consulta es, ¿en qué tipo de faltas, contravenciones o cuestiones interviene un jurado municipal en las ciudades de Estados Unidos? Con respecto a los jurados para crímenes, ¿qué aspectos suelen ser distintos?
It may have been clear, but hopefully Nancy can answer it.
So I've only seen what the city or the municipality in New Ken is considering, but the kinds of crimes oftentimes are misdemeanors. But again, if we use the example of municipal courts in the United States, the kinds of violations can vary from traffic violations to sort of disturbing the peace kinds of violations. So it really depends on municipalities and how they want to assign, what they want to assign. But in terms of in Argentina, I have not seen enough information yet to really give you a sense of what they're using.
All I would add is that in the research we conducted, the municipal juries often met only briefly for 1 or 2 days, but that's not uncommon for other kinds of juries either. We imagine that juries typically go on for several days or several weeks because that's what we see in the media for very high profile cases. But many jury trials, whether at the municipal or the county level, are actually, the trials are brief and the deliberation is brief. But the good news for democracy is that the benefits for the jurors are the same. So regardless of what the nature of the crime is or the complexity of the case itself, all citizens really can potentially benefit from the experience, the powerful democratic experience of serving on a municipal jury.
Otra pregunta puntual para John Gastil. Dice, cualquier persona puede ser influenciada por los medios de comunicación, ya sean jueces, juezas o jurados. ¿Qué respondería ante el planteo de que los jurados tienen un mayor riesgo de ser influenciados por los medios de comunicación en comparación con los jueces profesionales?
Sure. There's a tremendous amount of research conducted, not just in the United States, showing actually how similar the verdicts are that judges and juries reach. There are some differences, but to date, I haven't really seen differences that we could explain as the result of media bias. In any particular case, you might think that, say, a very high-profile crime, such as a recent trial here in the United States of a person who had gone to a protest with a firearm and ended up shooting protesters. You might think that in that case, the jurors could not help but be influenced by media. When we're selecting jurors for a trial, there are often questions asked about how much information they have, and we do tend to prefer juries that have not heard as much about the case in the media. But what I would point out is that you may find a jury that has not heard too much about the case in the media. You will not find a judge that has not heard about the case in the media, because the judges, by their very nature, attend to these sorts of news events almost as sort of a professional expectation of their knowledge of the law and the community. So ironically, you might have better luck finding a jury without bias from the media than you would finding a judge. Finally, I just can't emphasize this enough, that even people who come to the jury with prior personal knowledge, or perhaps media accounts they've read, really can do an excellent job of setting that aside. As Nancy said, they go from being private citizens to becoming sworn jurors. Jurors often report after a trial how sad they were with the verdict, how disappointed they were with the verdict that they had reached, because they felt the verdict was inevitable given the evidence. It wasn't what they wanted. It wasn't, their personal preference, but they felt bound by the law and the deliberation to reach the particular conclusion they did. That suggests to me a reasonably unbiased system.
And I would just add that we have some built-in processes. One is, as John mentioned, the voir dire, the questioning of prospective jurors. And when there's a lot of pretrial publicity, judges do question prospective jurors about that. And in those kinds of cases, there can also be a written questionnaire that's given to the prospective jurors. So you're giving them time to think about and respond to their what they've seen in a written questionnaire and in questions. And in a case where there's so much exposure, the trial can even be moved to another location. So there are structural ways in which we try to help prospective jurors ensure that they are not responding to these media reports. But again, to my point, and it's the jury process too that will help jurors, because as John noted, I mean, judges are equally exposed to these materials.
I will add one more detail, which is in the United States, judges can be very political. And so the verdict that the judge reaches may affect their career. We have removed judges because of particular verdicts. The jury does not have that political problem. So again, sometimes the jury will actually be less biased, less influenced by politics than a judge who is nervous about the next election, or perhaps their continuing appointment to the bench.
Otra pregunta abierta para cualquiera de ustedes tiene que ver con que el Tribunal Municipal de Jurados de Neuquén es de carácter voluntario. Entonces la consulta viene vinculada también con las estrategias para garantizar la representatividad, teniendo en cuenta no ya la obligatoriedad de la participación, sino la convocatoria voluntaria.
I'll speak first, then Nancy, you may wish to add. I hesitate to answer because it is not widely known how few Americans respond to a jury summons. I think the courts would prefer people to believe that the response rate is very, very high, but the research I have read suggests that it is relatively low, perhaps more comparable to the percentage of Americans who volunteer to vote. In other words, jury duty is compulsory. It is required of you, but many people ignore that requirement. My point is that the experience of jury service in the United States really is more voluntary than we maybe choose to admit. It was a joke among my research staff that our incredibly high response rates to our survey, 75, 80% of the jurors would fill out our surveys even months after their jury service. That very high response rate reflected the fact that these are the people who volunteer for jury service. So they're the same people who volunteer to fill out a survey. So hopefully the volunteer system will work well. But again, that may be more common practice than we would officially like to admit in the United States.
And I would add that one of the interesting things, one of the early studies that was done on response rates and jurors being summoned was to showed that when people had a choice or some control over when they got to serve, they were more likely at that point to come in. And so it might be, and we don't know, but it might be that being able to volunteer gives you that sense of control. And so your jurors might be, to the municipal courts, might be more responsive in the same way that our jurors who are summoned are and have control or respond to their summons. We don't know, but that could be a possibility.
If I may elaborate on that point, Nancy, this is very enjoyable answering questions with you. When you speak, you give me ideas for what to say. I think it is crucial that the reputation of the court and the jury process start as strong as possible. That is, you don't want to start with many, many problems and then slowly work them out. You really want to start strong, because in the United States, when people move from one county to another, sometimes they discover that the jury system in a new county has a terrible reputation. It's inefficient. You get summoned and they can't use you. It's very unresponsive. Whereas another county where I did much of my research in near Seattle, Washington, the jury system had a very strong reputation for summoning you when you really were needed, being responsive if you needed to serve at a different time, such as maybe for a teacher during the summer, and in general being accommodating, trying to work with your schedule, being very friendly and reasonable. So I agree with Nancy, you want to make it feel like something they volunteer to do, but the court helps them do it well, gives them a good opportunity to serve, and doesn't waste their time. So really, I appreciate how much care and thought goes into establishing the jury in Argentina, because I think you understand how important it is to start with as strong a jury system, as responsive and respectful a jury system as is possible.
Para ir finalizando, le voy a transmitir la misma pregunta que le había hecho a John, se la voy a transmitir a Nancy. En Argentina estamos próximos a implementar los jurados a nivel municipal. ¿Qué recomendaciones nos puedes realizar en base a tu experiencia?
So my three suggestions would be to make sure that the municipal jurors know that they need to take a vote, and that the act of voting, of raising your hand or of writing down your answer, is important, and that they also need to be told that they need to give reasons during their deliberations, that's what makes deliberating such an unusual experience, that you're giving reasons, you're not just giving your personal view, you're not just giving your personal preference, and that really elevates the deliberation. And I would add this third component, which is that after the jury reaches its determination, that it should have to go back into the courtroom, the municipal courtroom, and be polled individually in public to make sure that every juror supports that verdict. And those three additions, and some of them are implicit, but if they were made explicit, I think that that would be useful.
If I may, I add one word as well. That's fantastic, Nancy. What I want to underline or underscore is what Nancy is describing is the democratic moment, right? This is the analogy to voting in an election. The jurors really are voting. Even when it's unanimous, they all must vote. And so underscoring that behaviorally, right? Writing down your vote, raising your hand, being polled, they're all reinforcing that democratic experience. They're reminding the jurors that this is self-government. They are the government today. And so I would add two more things at the very end and then all the way back at the beginning. After the juror has done its verdict, I said this during my talk, but I want to emphasize it. When the judges take just 1 minute to thank the jury, personally, carefully, thoughtfully thank them, especially when they're a hung jury or a difficult case. Jurors remembered what the judge said years later. They could quote it back. Those words are so important. The judge won't remember them, but the jury will. The last thing is the very first moment when the jury shows up at the assembly room. I think sometimes we get too concerned. Like if you're a jury commissioner, you want to process the jury, get it through the room and to the courtroom. It is so important to stop and really give the jury some perspective, a little bit of training. Sometimes a judge stops by and talks to all the people who have shown up for jury service. We wound up doing a study on the effect of just that. For people who never got to serve on a jury, just being in that assembly room and getting that training actually changed their attitude towards the jury and a little bit towards the court. For people returning for jury service a second time, it even changed their understanding of the larger court system because they were listening at a higher level. So don't underestimate the value of a good orientation, and then don't miss the opportunity for a kind word at the end. Thank you so much.
And I would just add to that, I totally agree that the post-verdict interview with the jurors by the judge is so important, and it should take place in after every jury deliberation and verdict in order to make sure that the jurors feel satisfied with the experience and that they will go forward and be emissaries for the jury and to build on John's work and to be those more engaged citizens that we hope they will become. Thank you, and I am very glad to have done this with John. I think our work really builds upon each other's findings, and so I've learned a lot from this. Thank you.
Muchas gracias para John, para Nancy. Realmente ha sido una jornada muy no solo nutritiva en cuanto a los conocimientos que nos transmitieron, sino también a nivel personal, muy movilizada y muy emocionada por este homenaje que le estamos haciendo a Gustavo. Aprovechando la presencia como espectadora de Valerie Hans, no quiero dejar de mencionar que ella fue también un pilar muy importante para Gustavo cuando él ha decidido ir a estudiar, a realizar sus estudios en la Universidad de Cornell, y ha sido muy bien acogido por Valerie y su equipo de trabajo, así que también hacerle extensivo el agradecimiento a Valerie Hans. Ella también nos ha comentado que hay un artículo muy bueno que trataba este tema que estuvimos comentando, y ahí dejó el link para aquellos y aquellas que quieran consultarla acerca de los beneficios de los jurados de mayor tamaño. Agradecer nuevamente al INESIP por haberme permitido esta tarde compartirla con ustedes, y bueno, los esperamos ahora a las 5 en el próximo panel y luego a las próximas jornadas. Muchas gracias para todos y todas.